Thank you, Ed. That's a good point to bring in, Imam Omar. Is that how you would see the role of faith actors and religious leaders working at the local primarily, or from your experience, what role do you think faith leaders play in promoting reconciliation, Imam Omar?
Wonderful. So I think that I'm glad that you're actually pivoting to local when you speak to me, because I do feel like good local models actually can inform any type of global roadmap that we want to have work for faith communities across the board. I think it's very hard to implement anything that is ignorant or does not take into consideration the circumstances of various populations and different types of legislations that affect the religious communities that dwell in these areas. So I'll speak from a U.S. perspective, but I'll actually start from a very local context. I'll talk about New Orleans, Louisiana, which is where I was born. I tend to break, productive multi-faith engagement, interfaith dialogue into three categories. The first one being shared responsibility. And I think that that's where powerful trust is built, and it tends to be in the realm of charity, so there isn't much in terms of controversy there. It's just a matter of us championing the best of our values. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, Louisiana, I was there. The death toll was on par with September 11, but because it directly ties into government failure, in the case of New Orleans, it was quickly sort of swept under the rug and not spoken about in terms of, the U.S.'s role in terms of building community, especially when community's been destroyed by failed government policy. In New Orleans, Louisiana, the city was rebuilt primarily by faith communities, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Sikhs, others that came together to rebuild our houses of worship, to rebuild our communities, to fill in the void where the government had failed us. And it is one of the most inspiring stories that has never really been told at the global level, where you had faith communities rebuild one of America's great cities. I was blessed to be a part of that. So I've seen it within the realm of shared responsibility. When you're in shared responsibility, you don't feel like you're compromising anything of your faith's tenets. In fact, you feel like you are shining the light on the most beautiful values of your faith. You're almost competing in good, right? You want to show how the doctrine of charity and being neighborly and all of these values that we would, I'm sure, say are shared across our faiths, come to uniquely be prominent within our own traditions. The second category, the second bucket, gets a little bit more tense, and it's shared moral concern. And this is where faith communities end up sort of being at odds with societies that are becoming more secular, right? But I think that faith communities tend to have very similar shared societal concerns, moral concerns, and that usually means that you're looking at the way legislation is playing out as it affects especially religious minorities. And I think that there's an incredible amount of room there for faith communities to work together, especially in the West, especially in the U.S. context, where we can protect our faith communities as a whole, in these societies. The third one is where it gets most tense, which is shared moral commitments, coalitions that are built around shared moral commitments. This is where you are challenging government, where you are challenging society, where you are showing why we're supposed to be faith leaders in the first place. If we can't stand on truth, then how can we call ourselves faith leaders? If we shift with geopolitical winds or we shift with societal trends, how can we, wear that garb with sincerity when we're not willing to challenge gross moral injustices as we see them playing out? And so whether this means standing against racism, or standing against fascist policies, or standing against things that would affect the most vulnerable amongst us, whether they're faithful or faithless, whether they belong to our communities or not, this is where you start to see things become very tense. And especially when those shared moral commitments, those coalitions that are built around shared moral commitments, serve as a filtration of sorts, where faith leaders find themselves shackled in such a way that they can't speak to the most basic injustices, obvious injustices to any moral human being, decent human being in the world. And so when you talk about Gaza, for example, and the Gaza moment, yes, there's been a lot of fracturing. I can tell you many faith leaders that I've worked with in the past that I haven't spoken to in the last 2 years, or that have sent me text messages and said in private, I agree with you, but I can't say anything in public. And I say, well, that kind of contradicts the whole basis of our arrangement in the first place. But I can also tell you that there's something deeply inspiring about rabbis staging sit-ins at Union Station because of the genocide, in opposition to the genocide. And the way things are going in the US right now, I wouldn't be surprised if Jewish Voice for Peace gets designated as an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know where things are actually going, but I would say that shared moral commitments demand of us a certain level of courage, moral courage, and that's where faith leaders can actually lead, where society lags, on the basis of consistent values, on the basis of consistent human dignity, and speaking up for the vulnerable, no matter who the vulnerable it is, whether they're forgotten or whether they are intentionally erased. I have to mention this. I just met this incredible woman who's a Rohingya refugee who mentioned the plight of the Rohingya. How many faith leaders have come together to address the plight of the Rohingya? It's just not juicy enough politically. It doesn't tie into anyone's agenda neatly. Well, that's exactly where faith leaders are supposed to stand up and say, well, this needs to be an issue of global concern and not neglected and not forgotten.
I wonder, Imam Omar, where you see this going. I mean, Ed talked about recognizing different voices, but goodness, it's not as if every religious leader in every country talks with a voice of peace. I mean, sometimes the voices of religious leaders can do the opposite of that. They can be agents of polarization, and they can be agents to support ethno-nationalist divide. So how to go forward? We've got this call now for point 18 and a call for an interfaith dialogue. What would you see as an authentic way forward from where you sit?
Yeah, so I think since we bring up, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., peace is the presence of justice, right? It's not the absence of violence. It's not the absence of war. It's not the absence of tension. It's the presence of justice. And my fear and my skepticism with so many of these dialogues is that they often suffocate calls for justice, and they reinforce false framings that suggest that this was all just because Muslims and Jews just couldn't get along, and that's why you suddenly have an occupation and apartheid that's followed by a genocide and all sorts of tension that exists. You don't want to reinforce false framings, so you want to address issues head on, authentically. I think as Peter mentioned, away from the halls of power, because we are not, as faith leaders, meant to be brokers of power. We're supposed to be examples of conscience, and we're supposed to call people to consistent values of conscience and dignity across the board. And that means that we're going to often find ourselves at odds with many of the interfaith initiatives that are being launched from the halls of power. We often talk about rescuing faith from bad actors, from extremist groups. I also think you need to rescue faith from government sometimes. There's nothing that's a greater assault on our faith, I think, in this present age in terms of putting forth a roadmap than the Abraham Accords. I mean, when I came out against the Abraham Accords and wrote against the Abraham Accords, I was called by pastors and rabbis that I've worked with for years and said, we're not getting it. What's so wrong about this? And I said, I just can't imagine Abraham would stand for arms deals and apartheid. For me, you launch the Abraham Accords when you see Sha'ban, a young Palestinian, connected to an IV, burning in a hospital tent while the Super Bowl is going on in 2024. If that's not more emblematic of Abraham than anything else, then I don't know what is. And that's where we come together as Abrahamic voices, as people of Abraham, peace be upon him, and we say, no, enough is enough. And I think that there are great interfaith initiatives and multi-faith initiatives that are forming organically outside of the halls of power. And, we've used this term, decolonizing interfaith and decolonizing multi-faith work, that allows us to actually be authentic, because you have to capture the imagination, the real imagination of the people, the real pain of the people, and then give it a divine language. Give it a divine shared moral responsibility, and be consistent. Challenge your own community. So when any community, when any group of people are being harmed, even if it's by our own, people that wear our garb, we stand together and we say, no, we stand on the basis of consistent moral values, and beyond what's on a piece of paper, we believe in human dignity, in shared human dignity. That does not require us to give up anything of our faith. We can be authentic theologically. We can be authentic with the pain that we feel that's being inflicted upon us, but we can also be courageous in challenging the pain that is being inflicted by people that wear the same garb as us. But we are the Gaza generation. You can't get away from Gaza right now. It is the great moral issue of our time. Young people see it. There is, I can tell you that across the board in the United States, across religious communities, it's actually pretty consistent that you see young people that are standing up together, and that's not as a particular panelist at this forum suggested because TikTok is brainwashing them. It's because they're seeing children being shredded to pieces, and they're outraged by that and morally enraged, and we have to give that a divine language and a divine shared responsibility, then transfer that to other conflicts, those that are forgotten and those that have become polarizing because it's always my group versus yours. Consistency can only come out of integrity. Integrity can only come out of a sense of independence.
Thank you. Imam Omar, moment of opportunity for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in the United States, I can say that, prior to 2023, when any synagogue comes under attack, when any church comes under attack, especially black churches, which have increasingly come under attack, and unfortunately that has not been part of the conversation to the extent that it should be, but in places like Charleston, right, or a Sikh temple in Madison, we've stood together in front of places of worship when any community has been attacked. I will continue to do that. When anyone is attacked, I will stand with that person because I believe in the value of human dignity. I won't ask their political views or how they even feel about my dignity or my people, right, in any way in the tribalistic sense. I'll stand with you when your rights are being violated. I will stand for your dignity no matter how much I disagree with you. But I will also challenge you and challenge every component of society to hold themselves to consistency. It's been a very, very, very painful 2 years. As a Palestinian American imam, I can tell you that I received condolences quietly when Wadir al-Fayoumi, the young 6-year-old Palestinian boy, was hacked to death 26 times by a military blade, and his mother almost killed as well. And some of the same people that were justifying the murder of Palestinian children in Gaza were texting me and saying, we're very sorry and this should never happen. And I said, it shouldn't happen here, it shouldn't happen there. It shouldn't happen here, it shouldn't happen there. What's the difference between Wadir and myself, who happens to be a child of Palestinian refugees that was born in the United States, or a Palestinian who never made it out of Gaza? What's the difference between us? You can't fragment our humanity or our identity when we have not done that ourselves. And so it's just about consistency. How do we hold everyone accountable to consistent principles without becoming tools and instruments of powers, whether they're state actors or non-state actors, that consistently use those instruments for evil?
Thank you.